But there is something I would like to discuss today that is sort of separate from scenario table stuff. And what I'd like to direct your attention to for that, if you go into your Ninja Notes, go into your scenario-based content, and in the section that is labeled during exercise, you'll then go down to the cardiovascular system subsection, and you'll see a section that says special considerations. And there's 3 bolded things: CV drift, supine versus upright exercise, and arm versus leg exercise. Okay, if you've got your notes, nod if you've seen what I'm talking about here. Okay. So these are special considerations that I want to be able to teach about acute exercise responses, but they don't work their way into this very well. And I'll use this board here to try and describe those. The first one, CV drift. That's going to be in our scenario on Monday, our 3rd scenario. So I'm going to handle that there. Okay. But let's talk about supine versus upright exercise. I have talked about this already, so this is really just a review. Okay. Remember that there is a relationship between heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. If you multiply these 2 things together, you've got cardiac output, your blood flow. Okay? So what that means is if heart rate goes up and stroke volume stays the same, what happens to cardiac output? It goes up, right? You can see how the math would work. I don't even have to use numbers. Let me really throw a curveball at you. What happens if heart rate stays the same and stroke volume goes up? This goes up again, right? And if both of these go up, well, then this goes up a lot, right? I mean, you understand the relationship, okay? Well, what I want to focus in on is the fact that the intensity of what you're doing at any point in time, that tends to dictate what cardiac output you require. So if you were to change your body position during exercise, and the example that I used before in class, so I'll use it again, is upright cycling versus recumbent cycling. In such a case, you basically have a body position that's upright like this, meaning your heart is above the majority of your body. And to get that blood flow back to the heart, it's got to directly oppose the pull of gravity. Whereas with recumbent cycling, you're kind of laying down like this, and the heart is now roughly on a level plane with the blood flow in your extremities. So while there is resistance coming back to the heart rate, it's not as great of a gravitational resistance as we see here. So what this means is blood flow back to the heart is going to be better in this supine exercise situation, which means preload goes up. Remember that preload is like trying to fill your heart with extra blood like a water balloon. You're really stretching it out. And when preload goes up, stroke volume goes up. So if I was to compare during exercise responses between someone who's doing upright exercise versus supine exercise, and the key here is it's got to be a matched exercise intensity. Let's just say this is 100 watts versus 100 watts. Cardiac output is going to be the same in both scenarios because it's 100 watts versus 100 watts. If it's 125 versus 100, now I've got apples, oranges, I can't compare anything. But if it's the same exercise intensity, the only thing that's changed is the body position. Cardiac output stays the same, but by adopting a more supine position, we see that stroke volume goes up. So what happens to heart rate then? Kenzie, right. right? If this stays the same and this goes up, that means this has to come down in order for that to stay the same, right? And for that reason, the point I brought up was cardiac rehab. You're going to see a lot of recumbent cycles in a cardiac rehab facility because they're trying to protect the heart. They don't want it to have to work as hard. So stroke volume's going up in this type of position based on that extra preload stretch. It's stored elastic energy. It's free energy. The heart doesn't actually have to bind actin myosin to get that extra blood out every single beat. So heart rate gets to come down, which also relieves the heart of some extra work. So I wanted to bring it back up because this is a really appropriate time to do so. If we're talking about acute exercise responses, you should understand that body position will affect our cardiovascular response a little bit. And as long as we're looking at a matched exercise intensity that would require the same cardiac output, supine exercise increases stroke volume but decreases heart rate. Or the other way of looking at it is upright exercise has a higher heart rate, lower stroke volume. Does that make sense? Yeah. So on a quiz or an exam, typically for something like that, I would ask that as like a standalone question that doesn't get reflected in a table necessarily. Does that make sense? I wouldn't say, okay, Kiana is doing aerobic exercise and she's doing it on a recumbent bike. You know, when you get down to this, you're like, how do I reflect that? It doesn't make sense, right? So it makes more sense if it's just a standalone type of question. Okay. Cool. All right, well, let's talk about the last special consideration then, and that's arm versus leg exercise. So, like the upright supine thing, this really only makes sense if you're looking at matched exercise intensities. Let's say that someone is performing cycle exercise, so they're on a bike, okay? So their legs are really doing the work. Versus if they were seated and they're doing an upright, or I should say an upper body ergometer. Has anyone ever seen these before? Use them in rehab a lot. Maybe you got a leg injury. So now it's legs doing work versus arms doing work, okay? Again, the key for this comparison is you got to have matched exercise intensities. So let's just say this is 100 watts of normal cycling versus 100 watts of arm cycling, okay? Now, I know that for many of you, watts is sort of an unfamiliar unit. We have discussed it, but it may not be in your normal wheelhouse for how you would describe intensity. So the only context I can provide is that usually with your legs, 100 watts is really easy. And the reason for that is you've got a lot more muscle in your legs than you have in your upper body, right? Even the people who only focus on upper body at the gym and they've got what seems like little chicken legs and they skip leg day all the time, right? Friends don't let friends skip leg days. You know that meme, right? Even those folks have more muscle in their legs than their upper body. It may not look like it, but they do. So 100 watts of exercise with your legs is usually pretty easy. 100 watts with your arms is actually really, really hard. So if you don't believe me, I'm sure I can oblige. We can replicate this in the lab. So if you were describing leg versus arm exercise then, on the cardiovascular side, what would you expect to see that's different, say, in the arm scenario? Well, this is where I'll direct you back to your Ninja notes. There's really 3 focal points. The first one is that you would expect to see a greater heart rate, cardiac output, and rate pressure product during the arm exercise. So heart rate, rate pressure product, and cardiac output, those are all going to be greater during the arm exercise. And the reason for that is that this feels a lot harder, right? It's the same matched intensity, But here you might not be sweating at all, and here you're visually going to be struggling, right? So even though it's the same absolute intensity, the relative intensity, the perceived or felt intensity, not even comparable between those scenarios. So if you describe this as harder, even though it's the same, right, it would make sense as that heart rate and rate pressure product and cardiac output are higher, okay? So you'll see in your Ninja notes, those three things are higher for arm exercise, but underline the explanation behind that. Because usually what I'll ask on a question is, tell me what's different and why. And as we go through these other ones, you'll note that there's different explanations. So I want to make sure that you know which explanation fits with the appropriate responses. Okay? Systolic, diastolic, mean arterial pressure, and SVR for the arm exercise, those are all going to be increased. And that should make sense because you have less muscle mass in your arms than in your legs, which means that in order to perform this 100 watts of work, those arm muscles are going to be contracting much more forcefully than the leg muscles typically would. And because it's a more forceful muscular contraction, we see increased compression of the vessels, right? The same thing that we had talked about with resistance training would be applicable in this scenario because they're really forceful contractions. So it should make sense that vessel-based parameters increase for the arm exercise scenario, right? The last thing that's worth mentioning is that stroke volume and ejection fraction in our arm scenario, those will likely be lower than with leg exercise. And the main explanation for that is that we aren't getting the major benefits of the muscle pump. Remember, that was one of the regulators of blood flow that I talked about in cardiovascular phys, okay? When we take the legs out of it, that's a lot of muscles that can be working to kind of push blood back up to the heart. No doubt that the muscle pump is helping with the arms, right? But when you compare the muscle pump's effectiveness here versus there, it's no contest. So as a result, venous return to the heart would be lower here than there, and that's reflected with a lower stroke volume and a lower ejection fraction. Okay? Does that make sense? So that was the last special consideration that I wanted to be able to present to y'all, right? That these don't necessarily fit well into our table format, but they're really important points to bring up as it relates to acute exercise responses. And as it happens, those are all couched under the cardiovascular category. Okay?